Everyone at the funeral stopped talking. The room fell into dead silence. All eyes turned to the frail, elderly black woman who had just stood up. No one knew who she was. No one had even noticed her until now. But when she opened her mouth and revealed the truth, people gasped, jaws dropped, and lives were never the same again. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in Atlanta. The sky was clear, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the historic church on Auburn Avenue. Inside, the air was heavy with grief, love, and the scent of lilies. The church was packed. Over 200 guests filled every pew, all dressed in black, somber, and respectful. They had come to honor the life of Mr. Charles Whitman, a respected businessman, generous philanthropist, and to many, a pillar of the community. Charles had been more than just a success story. He was an inspiration. From humble beginnings to building a real estate empire, his journey had touched countless lives. The funeral program described him as a visionary leader, devoted husband, and beloved father, too. Those who had come knew the headlines, the accolades, the awards. To them, this service was more than goodbye. It was a tribute to a life well lived. The sanctuary was adorned with white roses and photographs of Charles through the decades, smiling at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, standing proudly beside his wife and children, shaking hands with mayors and community leaders. A soft slideshow played on a large screen above the altar. Gospel music floated gently in the background as guests whispered memories and shared hugs. People filed into their seats. Ushers directed them toward the front, reserving the first few rows for family, close friends, and dignitaries. Everyone seemed to know someone. They greeted each other with warm nods, handshakes, and quiet words of comfort. But in the very back corner of the sanctuary, almost hidden in the shadow of a pillar, sat an elderly black woman. She wore a plain black dress and a simple hat with a small lace veil. Her shoes were worn at the edges, and she held a small, faded leather purse in her lap. She had arrived early and sat alone, unnoticed by the bustling crowd. No one greeted her. No one sat next to her. Most people didn't even see her. Those who did cast puzzled glances her way, wondering if she had wandered in by mistake. "Who is that?" one woman whispered, nudging her husband. "Probably someone from the nursing home," he replied. "She must be lost," another muttered, brushing past her on the way to find a better seat. She remained still, her hands folded neatly over her purse, her eyes focused on the casket at the front of the church. There was no bitterness in her expression, no sadness, either, at least not the kind others wore on their faces. Her gaze was steady, almost peaceful, as if she knew something no one else did. The service began. The pastor opened with a heartfelt prayer. Charles's daughter stepped up to the podium and delivered a moving eulogy, her voice trembling as she spoke about her father's integrity, his strength, and his unwavering support for his family. A longtime business partner shared stories of Charles's brilliance in the boardroom, his knack for turning ideas into opportunities. A childhood friend recounted tales of their early days, how Charles had always been the one to stand up for others, even as a boy. Applause followed each speech. Laughter mixed with tears as people remember a man they had admired and loved. But through it all, the woman in the back said nothing. She clutched her purse a little tighter each time Charles's name was spoken. Every photo that flashed on the screen of Charles beaming at black-tie galas, standing beside luxury cars, or holding his grandchildren, seemed to stir something in her eyes. Not pain, not resentment, but something deeper, something unsaid. As the choir sang, "His eye is on the sparrow," her lips moved silently with the words. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she dabbed it with neatly folded tissue pulled from her purse. Still, no one approached her. No one asked if she was okay. No one wondered if she had known Charles. Not even when the service ended and people began filing out of the sanctuary. She stood slowly, her knees stiff, and made her way to the reception hall behind the church. Guests chatted over small sandwiches and sweet tea, reconnecting with old friends and exchanging memories of the man they had just laid to rest. The mood had shifted from sorrow to celebration, of a life full of achievement. But still, she was alone. She stood quietly at the edge of the food table. When she reached for a plate, others stepped in front of her. No one offered to help. No one spoke to her. It was as if she were invisible. She found a chair near the corner of the hall, set her plate down gently, and began eating in silence. A few glances away, curious now, perhaps, but still no one asked a question that lingered in the air. Who was she? Because what they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that this woman, forgotten in the corner, had once known Charles Whitman in a way none of them ever had. Not as the businessman, not as a philanthropist, not even as the family man. She knew the real Charles Whitman. And soon, the truth she had carried in silence for decades would shake the entire room. As the service continued, one by one, guests took to the podium to speak about the man they had come to honor, Charles Whitman. He built a company from nothing, said his longtime business partner, beaming proudly. He donated millions to local schools, added a local councilman, placing a hand on his chest. He was a loving husband and devoted father, his daughter said tearfully, her voice cracking. The sanctuary filled with nods, sighs, and the occasional soft sob. Tissues were passed down the pews like communion. People clung to each word, wrapping them around their memories of Charles like a comforting shawl. To them, Charles was a symbol of success and decency, a man who rose above his circumstances and lifted others along the way. The stories were polished and glowing, well-rehearsed like lines from play. Every speaker painted Charles as a flawless man, an inspiration, a role model. And yet, in the back of the room, the elderly black woman sat silent. Her eyes remained lowered, her fingers gently trembling as they clutched her worn purse. She did not nod. She did not cry. She didn't clap after the speeches or whisper about the slideshow that played behind the speakers. She simply sat, still and steady, absorbing every word like someone listening to a version of history they didn't quite recognize. When the service ended, the crowd moved slowly out of the sanctuary and into the adjoining banquet hall. The atmosphere shifted from sacred to social. The jazz band began to play a soft tune. Caterers served finger foods, mini sandwiches, deviled eggs, fruit, sweet tea, and coffee. The clinking of glassware and the low murmur of conversation filled the room. The woman followed quietly behind the others, her back slightly hunched, her movements slow but deliberate. She stood in line for food, alone. No one offered to let her go first. No one struck up conversation. In fact, some people glanced at her, hesitated, then stepped in front of her as if she weren't even there. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But the man in front of her didn't look back. He simply reached for a plate and moved on. Others followed suit. It was as if she were invisible. She finally gathered a few items onto her plate. One sandwich, 2 strawberries, and a single deviled egg. She took a paper cup of water and looked around for a place to sit. Most tables were full, filled with guests talking, laughing, and reconnecting. Some glanced at her as she passed, but no one made room. Eventually, she found a small table in the corner near the exit. It was slightly wobbly, and the chair creaked when she sat down. She opened a paper napkin on her lap and slowly began to eat in silence. The noise of the room continued without her. Toasts were made. More stories were told. One man even began telling jokes about Charles's old golf swing. Laughter rang out, but in the corner, the woman remained untouched by the moment until something unexpected happened. A small girl, about 8 years old, broke away from her mother's side and wandered toward the woman. She wore a pale yellow dress and held a half-eaten cookie in her hand. Her curiosity had led her away from the adults, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the woman sitting alone. She walked straight up to the table, tilted her head slightly, and asked with childlike innocence, "Ma'am, did you know my grandpa?" The woman looked up slowly. Her expression softened the moment her eyes met the child's. She smiled not with sadness, but with warmth, a smile full of memory and meaning. "Yes, baby," she said gently. "I knew him very well." Before anything more could be said, the little girl's mother rushed over, clearly embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "She just loves to talk to everyone." "It's quite all right," the woman said, still smiling at the child. But just as the mother was about to turn and walk away, the elderly woman slowly stood up, her back straightened, Her hand steadied. She cleared her throat softly and said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear, "If I may, I have something to say about Charles Whitman." The room didn't stop immediately. A few people continued talking, but those nearest her turned their heads. Then someone in the front gestured for the music to stop. Bit by bit, the noise died down. People looked toward her with a mix of confusion and curiosity. Some leaned to each other and whispered, "Who is she? Was she part of the family? I've never seen her before." The woman stepped away from her table, holding her purse in one hand. Her posture was now strong, as if years of silence had been lifted off her shoulders. She walked slowly toward the center of the room. The crowd parted. Every eye followed her. No one knew her name. No one knew why she had come. But something in her presence silenced even the loudest whispers. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak, everything they thought they knew about Charles Whitman was about to change. At that moment, the girl's mother rushed over, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor. She gently placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her voice laced with polite urgency. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. She likes to talk to everyone." She gave a brief, strained smile and began to guide her daughter away, back toward the cluster of family and friends near the buffet table. But before she could take more than a step, a voice, soft yet commanding, stopped her. The elderly woman stood up from her chair. Her movement was slow but sure, like someone who had made a decision they couldn't turn back from. She cleared her throat, once, twice, then said, loudly enough to cut through the music and chatter, "I have something to say about Charles Whitman." The room didn't fall silent immediately. At first, there was a ripple of confusion. A few people turned their heads. The soft jazz playing in the background continued for a few more seconds before one of the caterers, unsure what was happening, turned the speaker off. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Now the only sound was the low hum of the ceiling fans and the distant clatter of plates from the kitchen. All eyes shifted toward the woman. She stepped away from her small table, her black hat casting a faint shadow over her eyes. Her faded purse hung from her arm, and her worn shoes tapped softly against the floor as she moved forward. There was hesitation in the room, a quiet tension. She didn't wear expensive clothes. She hadn't been introduced by the family. She certainly didn't look like someone from Charles Whitman's prestigious social circle. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances. A few furrowed their brows. Someone near the back whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "Who does she think she is?" Another muttered, "Must be confused. Maybe she wandered in off the street." But others, especially those who had seen the little girl approach her, watched with growing curiosity. Something about her walk, the quiet confidence in her voice, made them pay attention. She reached the front of the room. No one stood in her way. People had subconsciously created space, stepping back as if drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. She stood beside the table that once held the guest book, now cleared of everything but a single framed photo of Charles smiling in a tuxedo. She turned to face the crowd. The silence was now thick, almost sacred. She looked slowly around the room, meeting eyes without flinching. Her presence was no longer small. It was powerful, unshakable. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried a quiet strength that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. "My name is Lillian Brooks." A few heads tilted. No recognition yet. Some of you don't know me, and maybe that's by design. But I knew Charles long before many of you ever met him. Murmurs fluttered through the room. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "We met in 1962, at a time when this country was burning with hate. I was working as a waitress in a small diner that didn't serve people who looked like me, not unless we cleaned the floors or worked in the kitchen." Gasps rippled through a few rows. Charles was one of the first white men who ever sat down at my counter, not to be served, but to stand with me. He knew what it meant, that it would get him in trouble, that he might lose friends, or worse. But he did it anyway. Now, people were truly listening. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't bring cameras. He didn't post about it on social media, because there wasn't any back then. He just looked at me and said, "You deserve better than this, Miss Brooks." And then he refused to leave until I was served. People in the audience were starting to shift emotionally and physically. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Charles wasn't perfect. None of us are. But he was brave. He carried guilt about his family, about the privileges he had, and about the people he couldn't always protect. And even after he became successful, he kept trying to make things right. Quietly, humbly. Tears now brimmed in the eyes of a few listeners, especially those who had only known the polished version of Charles. He used to visit my family every Christmas, even when he had a business to run and kids of his own. When my youngest son got sick and I couldn't pay the bills, Charles showed up with a check. No speech, no conditions. He just said, "Family looks out for family." Her voice caught for a moment. She dabbed her eye with the corner of her sleeve. You all knew the Charles who made it, who dressed in fine suits and sat on boards. But I knew the Charles who shared his last sandwich with a scared girl outside a Greyhound station. The man who cried when Martin Luther King was killed. The man who once stood between me and a police baton. The room was still, not even a cough. Everyone had forgotten their food, their phones, and their assumptions. They were looking not at a stranger anymore, but at a woman holding the missing pieces of man they thought they fully understood. And I came here today, not for recognition, not for drama, but because if Charles were here, he'd want this part of his story told. She turned back to the photo. He'd want you to know that the man you buried today was not just great because of what he built, but because of what he never let the world take from him. His heart. She stepped back quietly. Silence. Then applause. Soft at first, then swelling until it filled the room with thunderous respect. She spoke calmly, but there was unmistakable power in her voice. Not the loud kind, but the kind that holds generations of struggle and strength. The kind that silences a room not with force, but with truth. "My name is Lillian Brooks," she began, standing at the front of the banquet hall. Every eye was on her. Some people had their hands over their mouths. Others clutched their napkins tightly. No one moved. I met Charles in 1962, during the Civil Rights Movement. I was a waitress at a diner in Macon. It was one of those places where people who looked like me were welcome to serve, but never to sit. That night, the kitchen was busy, and I was on my feet for 10 straight hours. But I remember it so clearly. That's when Charles walked in. A few people in the audience blinked, as if trying to imagine Charles Whitman, the polished, Ivy League-educated entrepreneur, somehow fitting into that story. He was young, bold, and completely out of place. A white man in a suit walking into a colored section of town, sitting right next to me on the counter stool, not ordering a thing, just sitting there with me. Her voice trembled for a second, but she steadied it. He knew full well what that meant. The stares, the threats, the risk of being beaten, arrested, or worse. But he didn't flinch. He looked me in the eye and said, "You shouldn't be eating in the back. You deserve a place at the front." Gasps echoed across the room. A few people even leaned forward, as if drawn by a force larger than curiosity, something closer to revelation. You see, Charles didn't just give speeches. He didn't just write checks. He didn't just smile for the newspaper when the cameras were rolling. He marched. He bled. He was arrested twice for standing up to injustice. She paused, letting the words sink in. The second time, they locked him up for refusing to leave a protest line. He shared a jail cell with my cousin, who was beaten so badly he lost hearing in one ear. And Charles stayed with him through it. Never left. Never complained. Now there were no whispers. No muttering. Just silence. Deep, reverent silence. Over time, he and I became close. Very close, she said, her voice softening. Not just friends. Not just allies. We shared something rare. We shared trust. A bond built in the fire of a fight we both believed in. She looked around the room, making eye contact with some of the people who had earlier ignored her. When his company started to grow, long before diversity hiring was a buzzword, Charles made a point to seek out black engineers, black architects, black accountants. He hired single mothers who had been turned away everywhere else. He gave them real jobs, real chances, and he didn't just bring them in, He mentored them, respected them, treated them like family. Tears welled up in many eyes. One man in the back removed his glasses and wiped them, not for smudges, but to hide the way his vision had blurred. Charles visited my family every Christmas, even after his own family grew, even after his calendar filled up with business meetings and charity galas. He still came by with a pie and a story for my kids. We'd sit on the porch like the old days and talk about everything and nothing. She reached into her purse and slowly pulled out an old photograph. This was us in 1970, sitting in front of my mama's house. That baby on his knee, that was my son, Elijah. She held it up, and a few people craned their necks to see. When Elijah was 10, he was diagnosed with leukemia. We didn't have the money. I was working 2 jobs, barely making rent. One night, I came home and found an envelope on my table. Inside was a note that simply said, "You're not alone," and a check that covered every last hospital bill. Sniffles could be heard now, clearly and unashamed. He never told anyone, never asked for anything in return. That's who Charles was. A man who didn't want a statue or a building named after him. He just wanted to do right by people. She took a breath, steadying herself as emotion bubbled up. But time went on, and as his world changed, became more corporate, more political, our connection faded. Calls became fewer. Visits stopped. I understood. He had his life, and I had mine. She looked toward the front row, where Charles's family sat, his wife, children, and grandchildren. But I never hated him for it. I never felt bitter. I just made a promise to myself that the day he passed, I would be there, and I would remind the world who Charles Whitman really was. She turned back to the crowd, her eyes now wet with tears, but full of pride. Not just a businessman, not just a philanthropist, but a fighter, a friend, a man who believed the world could be better and did something about it. She bowed her head for a moment, and as she stepped away, the room was frozen. Then, soft, sincere applause began. A few people stood, then more, and more, until the entire room was on its feet. The woman who had once been invisible had just become unforgettable. For R.D., when Lillian finished, there was a moment of absolute stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, almost like a ripple through water, it began, soft, slow applause from the back of the room. A few hands clapping respectfully. Then more joined in, and within seconds, the room erupted into thunderous applause. People stood to their feet. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others clapped with both hands and hearts. It wasn't just polite gratitude. It was reverence, awe, and a kind of release. Charles's life had just been reframed. His memory deepened. Even his own children, raised in the comfort of his success, were crying, not just from grief, but from the weight of everything they hadn't known, everything he had carried quietly, without ever telling them. His oldest daughter stepped forward. Her face, streaked with tears, looked pale but filled with clarity. She walked straight to Lillian and wrapped her arms around the older woman without hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered through sobs. "Thank you for telling us who he really was." Lillian hugged her back with surprising strength. "He was always proud of you," she said gently. "He just didn't know how to say it out loud." The daughter nodded, burying her face into Lillian's shoulder for a moment, before slowly stepping aside to let her brother come forward. He looked stunned, eyes wide, posture awkward, as if he had just met his own father for the first time. I never knew," he said quietly. "He never talked about any of this." Lillian gave a soft smile. Some stories aren't told because they're secret. Some are just sacred. A line began to form. The very same people who had ignored her an hour ago, who had stepped in front of her in the food line, whispered about her during the service, and dismissed her as someone unimportant, were now standing, waiting just to speak to her. One woman, who had earlier whispered she must be lost, approached Lillian, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I feel ashamed." Lillian reached out, took the woman's hand in both of hers, and said, "Now you do. That's what matters." More came, people asking questions, wanted to know more about Charles's early years, about the marches, the arrests, the little things that made him the man he truly was, behind the title and the tailored suits. Some asked about her life, too, where she had gone, what she had done, and why she had never come forward before. "It wasn't my story to tell," she said, "until today." The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The reception, which had begun as a polite, upper-class gathering full of small talk and social courtesy, had transformed into something deeper, something human. People hugged longer. They spoke softer. They asked better questions. They were no longer just celebrating Charles's achievements. They were reflecting on the meaning of those achievements, on the quiet ways he had impacted lives without needing to be recognized. And in the center of it all was Lillian, an elderly black woman, once invisible, now surrounded by warmth, respect, and long overdue recognition. The pastor stepped back to the microphone, clearing his throat. His voice cracked with emotion as he addressed the room. "We came here today to celebrate the life of Charles Whitman. And we did. But we almost missed the part of the story that mattered most. The part that didn't make it into the papers. The part that didn't win awards. But the part that made him who he truly was." He turned to Lillian. "Thank you, Miss Brooks, for being his voice today. And thank you for reminding us that behind every great man is often a story that never got told." The room nodded in agreement. A few people applauded again, softer this time, but filled with meaning. Charles's wife, who had been silent throughout, finally stood. Her eyes glistened as she walked over to Lillian. She said nothing at first, just took her hands and held them tightly. "He loved you," she said finally. "I can see that now." Lillian simply nodded. "And I loved him, not just for who he was to me, but for who he tried to be for this world." As the reception wound down, people began taking photos of the old photograph Lillian had shown. Someone suggested having it framed next to the other pictures of Charles at the front of the room. "It belongs here," one woman said. "It is part of his legacy," another added. Lillian didn't ask for anything, not even a ride home. She quietly gathered her purse, straightened her hat, and began making her way toward the door. But this time, the room followed her, not with suspicion or silence, but with admiration. She didn't leave alone. Several people walked with her. A few offered her a ride. One young man said, "I want to interview you for our community project. People need to hear what you just said." She smiled. "Maybe one day." And just like that, the woman who had entered the church invisible walked out unforgettable. So, the next time you see someone sitting quietly in the corner, don't overlook them. They might be holding a story that could change everything you thought you knew. Like, share and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.